Have you ever felt a cold that settles deep into your bones? A chill that has absolutely nothing to do with the weather outside? Have you ever looked into the eyes of a young child and seen the heavy, undeniable weight of the whole world staring right back at you? It was late November in the year 1998. The sky over Erie, Pennsylvania was the color of bruised iron. The first real snow of the season was falling hard and fast. It was the kind of snow that did not melt when it hit the pavement. It stuck, it froze, and it turned the highway into a long, deadly ribbon of black ice. My name is Jackson Ford. Most folks out on the blacktop, they just call me Rooster. I was 55 years old, and I was feeling every single one of those years in my joints, in my back, and in my soul. I was wearing a leather jacket that was just about as scarred and as worn out as the man inside it. I had been riding hard all day trying to outrun the storm, but the storm was winning. My gas gauge was hovering right above the red line. My stomach was twisting empty and angry. I needed a break. I needed heat, and I needed coffee. I saw the glowing neon sign through the driving snow. It flickered, buzzing like an angry hornet buzzing bright red against the gray sky. It was a roadside diner, a forgotten, fading place on the edge of the city. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a couple of rusted pickup trucks and a salt spreader truck sitting silent in the corner. I pulled my bike under the overhang, killed the engine, and let the silence wash over me. The sudden quiet was heavy. I sat there for a minute, feeling the heat of the exhaust pipe, feeling the cold wind biting at my neck. I was tired. I was tired of the cold, tired of the noise, and mostly I was tired of always looking over my shoulder. I pushed the heavy glass door open. A small bell chimed above my head, a weak, lonely sound. The air inside hit me like a warm blanket. It smelled like old grease, burnt coffee, and wet wool. It was a smell I knew well, a smell I had known my whole life. It was the smell of the road. I walked past the empty booths, my heavy boots thudding against the checkered linoleum floor. I headed straight for the far end of the counter. It was a habit, an old instinct, that you never really lose. You sit at the end, you keep your back to the solid wall, and you keep your eyes locked straight on the front door. 30 years riding with outlaws. 30 years living on the raw edge of a knife. It changes a man. It wires your brain differently. Even when you are out of the game, even when you have walked away, you never really stop waiting for the hammer to fall. I had walked away 3 years ago. I forced some bad men to do some good things, and I walked away. But the shadow always follows you. The waitress was an older woman wearing a faded pink uniform with a name tag that hung crooked on her chest. She had kind eyes. Tired eyes, the kind of eyes that had seen a million strangers come and go. She poured me a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee without me having to say a single word. I wrapped my freezing stiff hands around that mug. I let the heat seep into my skin. I liked her right away. She wiped down the counter with a damp rag, moving slow, moving steady. "Nasty out there today, honey," she said. Her voice raspy like dry leaves scraping on a sidewalk. "It is," I said, my voice low, rough from the wind. "Got anything hot left?" She smiled a small, sad smile. "Got a fresh meatloaf just out of the oven, and one last slice of cherry pie sitting right under that glass dome over there. Made it myself this morning." "I will take the meatloaf," I said, taking a slow sip of the bitter coffee. "And save that pie for me. I am going to need it." She nodded, turned around, and walked toward the swinging double doors that led into the kitchen. That was when I felt it. A prickle on the back of my neck, a heavy, steady gaze. I turned my head slow, careful, and I looked across the diner. There, sitting in a corner booth all by herself, was a little girl. She could not have been more than 8 years old. She was wearing a bulky, oversized coat, a color that used to be yellow, but was now stained with dirt and grease. Her dark hair was tangled, falling into her eyes. Sitting on the cracked vinyl seat right next to her was an old tattered cloth doll. The doll was missing a button eye, giving it a blind, empty stare. But the girl was not blind. She was looking right at me. She was not just glancing. She was staring hard, unblinking, and entirely steady. I had the kind of face that usually made people look away. I had scars. I had a broken nose. I had a look that said I was not a man to be bothered. Kids usually they hid behind their mothers when I walked past. But this girl, she did not flinch. She just watched me, her dark eyes tracking every single move I made. I looked back at her. I tried to offer a small, reassuring nod, a silent message that said I was not going to hurt her. But she did not react. She just kept staring. The heavy kitchen doors swung open, hitting the wall with a loud smack. The cook walked out. He was a big man, heavily built, wearing a grease-stained white apron stretched tight over a large stomach. He had a flat, expressionless face. He did not look friendly. He did not look angry. He just looked completely empty. He walked behind the counter, moving slow, taking his time. He reached the far end, grabbed the glass dome, and lifted it off the cherry pie. He plated the slice, and he slid it down the counter, pushing it right in front of my face. He did not say a word. He did not look me in the eye. He just turned around, wiping his large hands on his dirty apron, and walked right back into the kitchen, letting the doors swing shut behind him. I looked down at the pie. The crust was golden. The filling was dark rich and leaking red juice onto the white porcelain plate. My stomach grumbled again, a loud, demanding sound. I reached out my right hand. I picked up the heavy silver fork. I was just about to break the crust. I was just about to take the first bite. A small, dirty hand slammed down on the counter right next to my coffee mug. The sudden noise cracked through the quiet diner like a gunshot. The heavy plate rattled against the counter. My hand jerked. The silver fork slipped from my fingers, clattering loudly onto the linoleum floor. I spun around, my muscles tensing, my heart kicking into a high gear. It was the little girl, Maya. She was standing right there, right beside my stool. She had moved so fast, so quiet, I had not even heard her cross the room. She was gripping the edge of the counter with both of her small hands, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. She was breathing hard, her small chest rising and falling. But her eyes were locked onto mine. Fierce and entirely fearless. "Do not eat that," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was not a scream. It was not a panicked warning. It was a command. It was the voice of someone who knew exactly what they were talking about. Someone who expected to be obeyed immediately. I stared down at her, completely stunned. I was a big man, a dangerous man, a man who had faced down guns, knives, and violence in the dark. I had stopped being surprised by things a long, long time ago. "Kid," I said, my voice rumbling deep and slow, "you need to mind your own business. Go back to your seat." She did not move. She did not even blink. She shifted her dark gaze from my face down to the slice of cherry pie, and then slowly back up to my eyes. "I watched him," she said, her voice steady, refusing to shake. "I watched the man in the back. I watched him put something in it. From his pocket. He put something in the food. For you." The air inside the diner seemed to stop moving. The faint hum of the neon sign outside felt deafening. The smell of the pie suddenly felt thick, heavy, and extremely dangerous. In 30 long years of riding the hard roads, in 3 decades of living a life that most people only see in nightmares, absolutely nobody, and I mean nobody, had ever managed to scare me. Until this exact moment. Until a little girl, a child I had never seen before in my entire life, stood in front of me in a fading diner in the freezing snow and told me that death was sitting on a white plate right in front of my face. How did she know? Why was she watching the cook? And most importantly, who was trying to kill me on a snowy Tuesday afternoon in Pennsylvania? My blood turned to ice water. I slowly pushed the plate away from me, the ceramic scraping harshly against the counter. I looked at the little girl, taking in the dirty coat. The fierce eyes, the old cloth doll, waiting back at her booth. She had just saved my life, and I knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that nothing was ever going to be the same again. I stared at the heavy ceramic plate. A puddle of thick red cherry juice was slowly pooling around the golden crust. It looked like blood. I looked at the kitchen doors, the worn wooden panels still swaying slightly on their hinges. Then I looked back down at the little girl. "Are you absolutely sure about what you saw?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She did not step back. She did not waver. "I was watching him the whole time," she said, her voice completely flat. "You were the only one sitting at the counter. You were the only one who ordered the pie." I set my hands flat on the cold linoleum counter. I did not fully believe her, not right away. I was 55 years old. You do not stay alive this long in my line of work by jumping at shadows or by trusting the wild imagination of a child. But you also do not stay alive by ignoring a warning, no matter where it comes from. I looked at her dirty coat, her small, steady hands. "Where are your parents, kid?" I asked. She looked down at the floor, staring at my heavy leather boots. "I am okay. By myself," she whispered. That was not an answer, and we both knew it. I pushed the white plate 6 inches away from me, the ceramic scraping loudly against the counter. Somebody in that greasy-smelling kitchen had just tried to put me in the ground. And a stray kid, a child I had never laid eyes on, had just stopped it from happening. Both of those facts needed a very fast, very clear explanation. I stood up. I am a big man, built thick, carrying the heavy, solid weight of a man who has spent his whole life pushing back against a hard world. When I stood up in that quiet diner, the whole room felt it. The air shifted. The tired waitress stopped wiping the coffee machine. An old trucker sitting alone in the middle booth slowly looked up from his newspaper. Maya just watched me. She did not look relieved. She looked tense, like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I walked past her, my boots thudding heavy on the floor. I pushed through the swinging wooden doors, stepping into the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen. The air back there was thick, hot, and choking. It smelled of old grease, burning meat, and bleach. The heavy-set cook was standing with his back to me, staring down at a sizzling flat-top grill. He was using a metal spatula to press down on a row of burger patties. The grease hissed and popped. He did not turn around. He did not flinch when the heavy doors banged against the wall. "You need something, buddy?" he asked, his voice low, completely devoid of surprise. "Yeah," I said, stepping further into the suffocating heat. "Turn around." The man took his time. He casually tapped the metal spatula against the grill, laid it down, and wiped his large, greasy hands on a dirty dish towel. He turned around very slowly and leaned his heavy back against the stainless steel prep counter. He had small, dark eyes buried deep in his fleshy face. He looked at me, and there was absolutely no confusion in his eyes. None. That was the very first thing I clocked. A normal man, A regular diner cook who sees a giant scarred biker barge into his kitchen should be startled. He should be angry or scared, or at least confused. This man was completely blank. He was waiting for me. "You got a problem with the food?" the cook asked, his jaw tight. "You put something in my pie," I said, keeping my voice low, keeping the rage perfectly contained. Nothing moved on the man's face, not a muscle, not a twitch. "I do not know what you are talking about, old man." "The little girl saw you," I said, taking one slow, deliberate step toward him. The cook sneered a short, ugly sound. "Little girls see all kinds of crazy things. You better get out of my kitchen before I call the cops." I took 2 more steps. I closed the distance between us in a heartbeat. "Empty your pockets," I demanded. "You got no right," he barked, his eyes darting just for a fraction of a second toward the heavy metal back door. I caught that look. I knew exactly what it meant. "Empty them," I growled, "or I will empty them for you." The cook lunged. His right hand reached behind his back, diving fast toward the deep pocket of his apron. He was big, but he was slow. I was old, but I was wired for violence. I crossed the remaining space in a single stride. I slammed my left hand flat against his chest, driving his heavy body backward. He hit the stainless steel wall with a massive, sickening thud. A row of heavy iron skillets rattled wildly on their overhead hooks, clanging together like loud, broken bells. "Do not do it," I warned him, my forearm pressing hard against his throat. He gasped, choking, but his hand still clawed at his pocket. I grabbed his thick wrist, twisting it hard, applying a brutal, searing pressure. He let out a sharp cry of pain. His fingers sprang open. Something small, something white, dropped from his hand. It hit the wet, greasy floor tiles with a soft tap. It was a small, folded paper pouch. It looked exactly like the kind of pouch an old-school pharmacist might use to fold up headache powder. But we were not in a pharmacy, and this was not aspirin. I kept my forearm pressed against his throat, holding him pinned against the wall. I slowly bent my knees, reaching down with my free hand, and scooped the paper pouch off the floor. I unfolded it with my thumb. White powder, fine, chalky, and completely odorless. The pouch was half empty. The other half was currently soaking into the cherry juice out on the diner counter. I stood back up, holding the folded paper right in front of his sweating face. "Who sent you?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. The man clenched his jaw. He stared at the ceiling, refusing to look at me. Sweat was beading on his forehead, mixing with the kitchen grease. "I am only going to ask you one time," I said, leaning my weight into my forearm, cutting off his air just a little bit more. "You know what I am capable of doing. You know who I am. Tell me." The cook gagged his face, turning a deep, dark shade of purple. He struggled, trying to pull oxygen into his lungs. "Tommy," he finally choked out his voice, a pathetic, broken wheeze. "Tommy Callahan." He said the name quietly, like he was terrified that just speaking the words aloud would summon the devil himself. I slowly eased the pressure off his throat. I stepped back, letting him slide down the wall, gasping wildly for air. Tommy Callahan, the ghost. I had not heard that name in over a decade. I had prayed I would never hear that name again for the rest of my natural life. Tommy Callahan was not a rival biker. He was not a gang enforcer. He was a phantom. He was a high-end, ruthless fixer. He was the kind of man who solved massive, expensive problems for massive, expensive people. He worked in the dark. He left absolutely no evidence, and he had a memory that spanned generations. If Callahan was hunting me, this was not a random hit. This was a calculated, heavily funded execution. How did Callahan know I was riding through Erie? I asked, looking down at the coughing cook. "I do not know," the man gasped, holding his bruised throat. "I swear to God I do not know. I just got a phone call. I just know what I was paid to do." "Which was what?" I demanded. "Put me down quiet. Make it look like an old man having a heart attack over a plate of pie." The cook nodded weakly, not daring to look me in the eye. I stood there for a long, tense moment. The heat of the kitchen was pressing down on me. The smell of the grease was making my stomach turn. I reached inside my heavy leather jacket. I have carried a thick, heavy-duty plastic zip tie inside my inner pocket for over 20 years. You never know when you might need to secure a problem. I grabbed the cook by the collar of his apron, hauling him roughly to his feet. I dragged him toward the back wall, near the deep fryers. There was a thick, solid iron gas pipe running vertically from floor to ceiling. I shoved him against the pipe. I grabbed his wrists, crossing them tight behind the cold iron, and quickly ratcheted the thick plastic zip tie around them. I pulled it brutally tight, locking him securely to the plumbing. "Do not make a single sound," I told him, leaning close to his ear. "Do not yell. Do not call for help. The waitress will come back here in about an hour to find you. You stay quiet until then. If I hear you scream, I will come back inside." He nodded frantically, his eyes wide with genuine terror. I turned my back on him. I walked away, pushing back through the swinging wooden doors, leaving the stifling heat of the kitchen behind me. I stepped back out into the diner. The air felt instantly cooler. The diner was still completely silent. The tired waitress was standing frozen behind the main counter, both of her hands pressed flat on the formica surface. She was staring at me, her eyes wide, her face pale. The old trucker in the booth had his flip phone half pulled out of his jacket pocket, completely undecided on what he should do next. I reached into my jeans pocket. I pulled out a crumpled $50 bill. I walked over, smoothed it out, and laid it flat on the counter right next to the poisoned pie. "For the meatloaf," I said to the waitress, my voice calm, smooth, and steady. "I apologize for the disturbance, ma'am." I sat back down on my stool. By all the unwritten rules of the road, this should have been the exact moment the story ended. The immediate threat was handled. The corrupt cook was tied to a pipe. I knew the name of the dangerous man who had sent him. I could have walked out that front door, kicked my motorcycle into gear, and been 2 whole counties away before the local police even showed up. I had vanished into the wind from much harder, much bloodier situations than this, but I did not leave. I looked over my shoulder. The little girl Maya was still sitting in the far corner booth. She had not moved a single inch during the entire commotion. She was sitting perfectly still, clutching her broken cloth doll, watching me with those same ancient, steady eyes. I could not leave her. I had to know. I stood up from the stool. I walked across the faded linoleum floor, the sound of my boots heavy in the quiet room. I walked over to her booth, and I slid into the cracked vinyl seat, sitting directly across from her. I slid into the cracked vinyl seat, groaning softly as my old knees bent. The booth smelled like stale cigarette smoke, lemon cleaner, and old leather. I sat directly across the small table from her. I leaned my heavy forearms on the formica surface. I looked at her deeply, and she looked right back. Most children would be crying right now. Most kids would be hiding under the table, absolutely terrified by the yelling, the sudden violence, and the massive, angry man who had just pinned a cook to the wall. Maya was not crying. She was not shaking. She was just sitting there, perfectly still, perfectly calm, holding her one-eyed cloth doll tightly against her chest. "Are you all right, kid?" I asked her, keeping my rough voice low, keeping it as gentle as a man like me could manage. "Yes," she said. Her voice was quiet, incredibly soft, but it did not waver. It did not shake. "You are not going to ask me what just happened back there," I said, raising a thick gray eyebrow. "No," she answered simply. I studied her small face. She had dark smudges of dirt on her pale cheeks. She had deep, heavy shadows under her dark eyes. She carried a quiet, terrifying strength that made my chest ache with a sudden sharp pain. I looked down at the table. I noticed her white ceramic plate was completely empty. Not a single crumb of food was left. She just had a tall glass of ice water, holding it carefully with both of her small, freezing hands. The rest of the diner slowly settled back into its normal, tired rhythm. The old trucker in the middle booth let out a long breath, shoving his flip phone back into his flannel jacket, going back to his newspaper. The pale waitress disappeared through the swinging doors, completely oblivious to the man hid up in the back corner of her kitchen. Outside the window, the freezing wind pressed hard against the heavy plate glass. The snow was falling much heavier now, thick white and blinding. A rusty sedan moved slowly through the snowy parking lot, its tires crunching loudly on the ice. It pulled around to the far side of the brick building, disappearing from view. I watched it go, my eyes tracking the taillights. My tense shoulders finally came down an inch. The immediate adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving behind a cold, hard exhaustion. I looked at the frayed yellow canvas backpack sitting on the seat right beside her. "Where are you headed?" I asked, leaning back against the cold vinyl. "South," she said, her voice completely flat, completely determined. "Who is waiting for you down south?" I asked, watching her eyes carefully. She looked past me, staring out the foggy window at the howling blizzard. "Nobody is waiting," she whispered, "but I need to get there." "How did you get all the way out here to Erie in the first place?" I asked. "I took a bus," she said, clutching the old doll tighter. "But the bus does not go any further today. The driver said the roads are too bad." I watched her for a long, silent minute. There was something very strange about the way she said the word south. She did not say it like it was just a general direction on a map. She said it like it was an address. Like it was a sacred destination, like someone had given her that specific word and told her it was the only thing that mattered. "Do you have family down that way?" I asked, leaning forward again, resting my chin on my hands. "Aunt, uncle, grandparents." She looked up at me. For the very first time since I had walked into that lonely diner, something finally shifted in her dark eyes. It was not exactly sadness. It was something much quieter, much heavier. It was the look of someone carrying a burden entirely too large for their small shoulders. "Maybe," she whispered softly. I leaned back again, staring out at the freezing, empty parking lot. I had my heavy motorcycle parked under the front overhang. I had my warm leather gear. I was already heading south, riding toward the dense, foggy pine forests of Asheville, North Carolina. I was running away from the noise, running away from the ghosts of my past. The logical thing to do, the smart, safe thing to do, was to get this little girl to the local police station. I needed to get her off the streets, make sure she was warm and fed, and then ride away as fast as my engine could take me. I had done a good deed for the day. I had survived a professional hit. The smart move was to vanish into the snowstorm. I reached across the table, picking up my warm coffee mug. I brought it to my lips, ready to take a long, bitter sip. That was when the heavy front door of the diner swung open. The small brass bell above the door chimed a sharp, frantic ringing sound. A violent blast of freezing, snowy air rushed into the warm room, carrying the smell of ice and exhaust. 2 men walked inside. They were not local Pennsylvania boys. I knew it instantly. I knew it before they had even taken 3 steps onto the checkered linoleum floor. Their heavy leather boots were too clean, completely free of salt and mud. Their dark, expensive wool coats were entirely wrong for a cheap roadside diner. But it was their eyes, cold and dead, that truly gave them away. Their eyes moved through the diner with a chilling, clinical precision. They looked at the booths. They looked at the counter. They looked at the shadows. They were not casually looking around for an empty table to eat a hot meal. They were scanning. They were hunting. They were looking for something very specific, and they were looking for it now. They were looking for me. Tommy Callahan, the ghost, did not just send a cook with a powder packet. He always sent a backup team to verify the kill. I slowly, silently set my heavy coffee mug back down on the table. I did not make a single sound. I kept my large hands flat on the table, keeping them perfectly still. I leaned slightly forward, cutting off the distance between Maya and myself. "Do not turn around," I said to her, my voice dropping to a very quiet, very firm whisper. "Do not look at the front door. Do not look at those men. Keep your eyes locked right on me." She did exactly what I told her. She did not hesitate. She stared straight into my eyes, her small face pale, her jaw set tight. "We are going to stand up in about 30 seconds, I whispered, my heart beginning to hammer a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "We are going to walk toward the back hallway, right where the bathrooms are. There is an old metal back exit door sitting right next to the mop closet. We are going to walk through that door, and we are going out into the cold. Do you understand me?" "Okay," she said. Her voice barely a breath. She said it so calmly. She answered me like she had done this 100 times before, like fleeing for her life was a normal Tuesday afternoon. That bothered me. It bothered me deep in my gut, but I had to file that dark thought away for later. Right now, we had to survive. I slowly stood up from the vinyl booth. I reached out, putting my heavy leather-clad hand gently on her small, trembling shoulder. I guided her out of the seat, grabbing her yellow backpack with my free hand. I kept my massive body perfectly positioned between her and the front of the diner, blocking their line of sight. I did not look at the two men. Looking directly at a predator signals awareness, and awareness triggers an immediate attack. I moved slow, shuffling my heavy boots, slightly acting completely natural. I walked like an old, tired man who simply needed to use the restroom after a long meal. I heard one of the men step up to the front counter. I heard his boots thud heavily on the floor. I heard him say something to the pale waitress, his voice low, demanding, and sharp as broken glass. I heard her stammer, dropping a spoon, starting to answer him in a shaking voice. I did not wait to hear the rest of the conversation. I pushed Maya gently but firmly into the dark, narrow hallway. We rushed past the rusted bathroom doors, abandoning the slow, tired walk. We reached the heavy metal door at the back of the building. It had a thick, rusted push bar across the middle. I slammed my hand against the cold metal bar, shoving the heavy door open with all my strength. The freezing Pennsylvania air hit us like a solid wall of ice. We stepped out into the dark alley behind the diner. It was a bleak, miserable, freezing space. There was a frozen gravel lot, a row of massive white steel propane tanks, and a rusted green dumpster overflowing with rotting trash. The snow was blowing completely sideways now, biting viciously at my face, stinging my eyes, cutting through my heavy clothes. My motorcycle was parked out front, sitting under the main overhang. It was completely useless to us right now. If we went back out to the front lot, those armed men would have a clear, easy shot through the falling snow. I made the tactical calculation fast, my mind racing through the desperate options. The pickup trucks in the front lot were too exposed. The side of the brick building offered absolutely no cover. We had to move slowly along the back wall, reach the far corner, and then make a blind, desperate run across the open snow toward the highway. I knelt down in the freezing slush, ignoring the cold water seeping into my jeans. I looked Maya right in the eyes. The bitter wind was whipping her dark hair violently across her face. She was shivering, clutching her broken doll against her chest. "My bike is on the other side of this building," I yelled over the deafening, howling wind. "When I tell you to run, you run, and you do not stop for anything. You get right on the back of my bike, you wrap your arms around me, and you hold on tight. Do you hear me?" "Yes," she yelled back, her small teeth chattering loudly. "Have you ever been on a motorcycle before?" I asked, wiping a thick layer of freezing snow from my eyelashes. "No!" she yelled, her eyes wide with fear and adrenaline. "Well," I said, offering her a grim, tight smile in the freezing dark, "there is a first time for everything." I moved us carefully along the freezing brick wall. The wind was screaming, pulling the heat right out of my bones. We reached the sharp corner of the building. I pressed my heavy back against the frozen, rough brick. I held up one thick finger, silently telling Maya to stay exactly where she was. She nodded once, pressing her small body flat against the wall, clutching her dirty canvas backpack. I leaned forward, peering slowly around the edge of the brick. One of the men in the dark, expensive coats was already outside. He was standing near the front corner of the diner, ignoring the blowing snow. He was scanning the empty parking lot, his eyes moving with cold, mechanical precision. His right hand was tucked deep inside his dark wool coat, resting right where a heavy shoulder holster would sit. He was not looking around casually. He was hunting. And he was hunting me. I pulled my head back. I looked at Maya. I took a slow, deep breath of the freezing, bitter air. I had to end this fast before his partner came out the back door, before we were trapped in the alley. I moved. I did not run. Running makes noise. Running makes you slip on the ice. I stepped out from the cover of the brick wall. I closed the distance between us, moving like a heavy, dark shadow through the blinding snow. I reached him in 3 massive, silent strides. He started to turn, sensing the sudden movement behind him. He was trained, but he was entirely too slow. Before he could pull his weapon, before he could even shout a warning, I drove my heavy, leather-clad elbow straight into his face. The impact was brutal. The bone in his nose cracked loudly, a sharp, sickening sound in the cold air. He dropped instantly, his eyes rolling back in his head. He collapsed into the freezing slush, completely unconscious of us, without making a single sound. As he fell heavy to the ground, his coat pocket snagged on his belt. Something slipped out, landing softly in the wet snow. It was a thick, dark leather notepad. It was the kind of heavy zippered planner that private investigators used, back in the late 90s before the world went completely digital. I knelt down, my stiff, freezing fingers scooping it up from the slush. I flipped the leather cover open. Tucked neatly inside the front pocket were 3 physical, glossy photographs. I stared at them, the snow blowing fiercely around my face. My blood ran completely cold. The first photograph was a picture of my face taken from a distance, showing me walking out of a cheap motel in Ohio just 2 days ago. The second photo made my stomach turn to heavy lead. It was a picture of a small white house with a faded blue door. It was my younger sister's house, sitting quiet and peaceful in a suburban neighborhood in Indiana. I had not spoken to her or seen her in over 10 long years. I stayed away to keep her safe. The third photo was a Polaroid of the diner we were just standing inside. This was not a random lucky hit. This was not a chance encounter. This was a deep, calculated, highly funded hunt. They were tracking my route. They were tracking my bloodline. I shoved the heavy leather notepad deep inside my jacket pocket. I sprinted back to the corner of the brick wall. Maya was waiting, her dark eyes wide. "Run!" I barked over the howling wind. We dashed across the slippery frozen lot. The wind ripped at us, trying to push us back. We reached my motorcycle, parked under the flickering front overhang. It was a massive custom-built V-twin cruiser, heavy, loud, and built for long, punishing miles. I swung my heavy leg over the cold leather seat. I reached down, kicking the starter hard. The massive engine roared to life on the first try. It was a loud, angry, beautiful sound, shaking the freezing air around us. "Get on!" I yelled over the deafening engine. Maya scrambled up the side of the bike, her small boots slipping on the chrome pegs. She settled onto the back seat. She wrapped her small, freezing arms tightly around my thick waist. Her grip was absolutely terrifying. She held on like a vice, digging her small fingers deep into my heavy leather jacket. I slammed my heavy boot down on the gear shifter. I twisted the throttle back. We tore out of the parking lot, the back tire spinning wildly, fighting desperately for traction on the treacherous black ice. We hit the dark, empty highway, leaning hard into the turn, and roared straight out into the blinding, freezing storm. We rode hard. We rode fast. The snow was falling in heavy, blinding gray sheets. The bitter wind ripped at my face, stinging my eyes, cutting through my thick clothes like 1,000 tiny knives. I kept my vision locked entirely on the faint icy lines of the dark road. I checked my round, vibrating mirrors every few seconds, my heart hammering against my ribs. I saw absolutely nothing but blackness and swirling white snow. There were no headlights following us. There was no pursuit. We were clear for now, but the cold was quickly becoming our biggest enemy. The temperature was dropping fast. I could feel Maya shaking violently against my back. Her small body was trembling uncontrollably. Her teeth were chattering so loud I could hear the sharp sound over the roaring, thundering engine. She was only 8 years old. She was wearing a cheap, dirty coat. She was not built to survive a winter ride on an open highway. I had to get her out of the brutal wind before the cold did what those armed men could not. 15 miles down the dark, icy highway, I saw a massive dark shape looming ahead in the blowing snow. It was an old abandoned concrete highway underpass. It was a dark, dirty tunnel, but it offered a small, desperate pocket of dry shelter. I pulled the heavy motorcycle off the main road. The tires crunched loudly over the frozen, discarded gravel. I guided the bike deep under the thick concrete bridge, completely out of sight from the highway above. I hit the kill switch. The roaring engine died instantly. The sudden silence was heavy, thick, and ringing loudly in my cold ears. The wind howled furiously outside the concrete tunnel, screaming through the metal bridge supports, but inside, it was dead dry and bitterly, achingly cold. I kicked the heavy metal kickstand down. I slowly swung my stiff, aching leg off the bike, my heavy boots hitting the dirt. Maya stayed sitting on the back leather seat. She pulled her knees up to her chest, shivering violently, her arms wrapped tightly around her dirty yellow backpack. I stood there for a moment, letting my breathing slow down. The wild, chaotic adrenaline of the escape was finally starting to fade. It was leaving behind a cold, sharp, terrifying clarity. I reached inside my heavy jacket. I pulled out the stolen leather notepad. I opened it under the faint gray light of the storm. I looked at the glossy photograph of my sister's house one more time. My chest tightened, filling with a dark, violent, protective anger. Richard Sterling, the man I had ruined 3 years ago, was finally making his move. He had hired the absolute best, and he was coming for everything I had ever loved. I slowly closed the leather notepad. I slipped it back inside my pocket. Then I turned around, and I looked at the little girl sitting on my motorcycle. "You did good, kid," I said, my voice rough, echoing loudly in the dark, empty concrete tunnel. "You held on tight. You did exactly what I told you to do when I told you to do it." She nodded slowly, her dark, tangled hair plastered to her wet, freezing cheeks. "I am very cold," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind outside. "I know you are," I said, taking a slow step closer to her. "We will find a fire soon. We will find a safe place. But right now, right this very second, we need to have a very serious, very honest talk." I leaned my heavy leather-clad forearms against the cold metal gas tank of the motorcycle. I leaned in close. I looked her directly, deeply in the eyes. I did not soften my gaze. I did not treat her like a fragile, broken child. I treated her like the only person in the entire world who held the dangerous answers I desperately needed to stay alive. Back there in the diner, I started keeping my voice low, firm, and completely steady. "You saved my life. You saw a man put poison in my food, and you stopped me from eating it. But Tommy Callahan, the man who sent those killers today, he does not work in the light. He is a ghost. He is a phantom. He does not let little girls see him work. He does not make mistakes. And you sitting completely alone in a dirty diner, waiting for a bus going nowhere, you were watching that kitchen door like a trained veteran guard dog." I took a slow, deep breath, letting the freezing, dry air fill my tired lungs. I stared into her dark, ancient eyes. "I need you to tell me something, Maya," I said, my voice dropping to a heavy, demanding whisper. And I need it to be the absolute, undeniable truth. No lies, no stories. How did you know to warn me back there? Out of all the people in the world, how did you know I was the man in danger? The heavy silence in the concrete tunnel stretched out. It was a suffocating, unbearable silence, broken only by the distant, lonely howling of the Pennsylvania wind. Maya sat completely still on the freezing leather seat of my motorcycle. The howling wind screamed past the concrete opening of the tunnel, a loud, vicious sound. But inside our small, dark pocket of shelter, the silence felt heavier than a physical weight. She did not look away. She did not break my gaze. Her small face was pale. Her lips were turning a faint shade of blue from the bitter cold, but her dark eyes were burning with a fierce, absolute determination. "My mom told me about you," she finally whispered. Her voice was incredibly quiet, scraping softly against the dark concrete walls of the underpass. I did not move. I kept my heavy forearms resting on the cold metal gas tank. I did not push her. I did not rush her. When a scared, freezing kid starts to talk in the dark, you just shut your mouth. You stand perfectly still, and you listen to every single word. "She told me that if anything ever happened to her," Maya continued, her small fingers picking nervously at a loose thread on her yellow coat, "and if I could not find anyone else to help me, I was supposed to go find you." She swallowed hard, a dry, painful sound. "She said you would be very hard to find. She said you did not like to stay in one place for very long. But she told me that you always rode through Pennsylvania right before the heavy snow hit the mountains. She said you always stopped at the diners near the highway because you liked the black coffee." My thick, leather-gloved hands tightened slowly around the cold metal handlebars. I felt a strange, cold pressure building tight inside my chest. It was a feeling I had not felt in a very, very long time. "What is your mother's name, Maya?" I asked, my voice dropping to a rough, gravelly whisper. Maya did not answer me right away. She slowly unzipped the top pocket of her dirty yellow canvas backpack. Her small, freezing fingers were shaking so violently, she struggled with the cheap metal zipper. She reached deep inside the frayed bag, pushing past a crumpled sweater, and pulled out a small, folded piece of notebook paper. The paper was old, heavily creased, and stained with dirt along the edges. She held it tightly in her small hand for a second, looking down at it like it was the most valuable thing in the entire world. Then she slowly held it out toward me. I took the small piece of paper from her trembling fingers. I unfolded it, moving carefully, afraid the fragile paper might tear in the cold air. I held it up, tilting it slightly to catch the dull gray light bleeding into the tunnel from the storm outside. There, written in neat, elegant cursive, right in the center of the page, was my full name. Jackson Ford. Below my name, there was a short list of highway numbers, including the exact route we were standing next to right now. And below that, signed at the very bottom of the page, was a name that made my heart completely stop beating. Elena Rostova. The roaring wind outside the tunnel suddenly vanished from my ears. The biting cold disappeared. I was 55 years old, standing in a freezing tunnel running from professional killers. But in that single shattering moment, I was suddenly 35 again. I had known Elena Rostova for exactly 1 year, exactly 20 years ago. It was the summer of 1978. She was young, she was wild, and she possessed a bright, blinding light that I had never seen before in my dark, violent world. We had met at a loud, chaotic biker rally in Daytona. We got close, the kind of dangerously close that happens when two completely different people are both desperately running away from their pasts. For a few short, beautiful months, I actually thought I could change. I thought I could leave the gang, leave the violence, and build a quiet, decent life with her. But a man like me, a man with too much blood on his hands, cannot just walk out of the darkness. The violent life always pulls you back. The gang needed me. The brutal work called my name. When I finally went back to the chapter to handle a vicious turf war, Elena packed her bags. She told me with tears streaming down her face that she simply was not built to survive in my brutal, bloody world. She walked away, and I, knowing she was entirely right, let her go without a fight. I thought about her over the years. Not every single day, but sometimes on the long, quiet, lonely stretches of highway, her bright smile would flash across my mind. I stood in the freezing tunnel staring down at her elegant handwriting. I felt completely hollowed out. "Maya," I said slowly, forcing the heavy words past the tight knot in my throat. I looked up from the paper, looking at the freezing little girl sitting on my bike. "How old are you?" "I am 8, she said, pulling her dirty coat tighter around her small shoulders. "I will be 9 next month." I did the math in my head. It was simple, undeniable math. She was born long after Elena and I had parted ways. She was not my daughter by blood, but she was Elena's blood, and that meant something deep, something unbreakable to a man who lived by loyalty. "What happened to your mom, kid?" I asked, my voice completely soft. Maya looked down at her small, scuffed boots. Her jaw clenched tight. "She got sick," she said, her voice dropping into a flat, factual tone. "She got very sick for a very long time. The doctors tried, but the medicine stopped working. She died in the hospital back in October. She said the words exactly the way children say terribly hard things. She spoke with a flat, empty rhythm, because she had not yet found another safer way to carry the massive weight of that grief. She was just stating the brutal facts of her life. "I am so incredibly sorry, Maya." I whispered the words, feeling horribly inadequate. "Is there absolutely nobody else? No grandparents, no aunts or uncles?" She slowly shook her head, her dark hair brushing against her wet cheeks. "No, it was just me and her, always." She reached out gently, touching the folded piece of paper in my hand. "She told me about you about 3 weeks before she died." Maya said, her voice barely a breath. "She wrote your name down. She said you lived out on the open road and that you would be incredibly hard to track down. But she said if I waited at the diners near the highway, right when the snow started, you would eventually ride past. Maya paused, taking a slow, shaky breath. She told me that you were the absolute only person in the entire world that she completely trusted with her life, she whispered. I stared over the handlebars, looking out into the swirling, violent snow. My heavy chest was doing something strange, something painful, something I could not easily name. Did she tell you anything else about me? I asked, not really sure if I wanted to hear the honest answer. Maya nodded her head. A small, faint ghost of a smile touched the corners of her freezing lips. She said that you used to be a very scary man, Maya said quietly. And then she said actually you were probably still a very scary man. But she told me that I should never be afraid of you. She said you were the good kind of scary. She said you protected the people who could not protect themselves. I closed my tired eyes for a second. I let her heavy words settle deep into my bones. Elena had not sent her daughter to me because I was a good, safe guardian. She knew I lived a dangerous, violent life. She sent Maya to me because she knew in the cold, brutal math of the world, I was the only man capable of keeping her child alive. When did you leave your house, kid? I asked, opening my eyes. 14 days ago, she answered, holding her one-eyed doll tightly. The state people, the ones with the clipboards, they came to take me to a group home. I packed my bag. I sneaked out the back window. I had some cash saved up in a jar. I took 3 different buses. I was very careful. I looked closely at her small, freezing face. 8 years old, 14 days alone on the brutal road, sleeping on buses, hiding in greasy diners, looking out the window for a scarred, dangerous man whose name was written on a dirty piece of paper. I had spent my entire adult life surrounded by hard, violent, unbreakable men. But looking at this little girl, I knew I was looking at something much harder, much braver than any outlaw I had ever ridden with. All right, I said, folding the piece of paper carefully and sliding it deep into my warm inside pocket right next to my pounding heart. I pulled out the dark leather notepad I had taken from the killer in the alley. I flipped it open, looking at the glossy photograph of my sister's house in Indiana. Richard Sterling was hunting me. He was mapping my routes, threatening my estranged family, and he had sent the best killers money could buy to put me in the ground. He thought I was alone. He thought I was an easy, tired target. But Richard Sterling had absolutely no idea who was sitting on the back of my motorcycle. He had no idea that a ghost from my past had just handed me a completely new reason to fight. Here is what we are going to do, Maya, I said, my voice turning hard cold and entirely focused. We can not stay out here in the snow. We need a fire. We need hot food. And we need a place with very thick walls. I know an old man, a grumpy old mechanic who lives up in the mountains of West Virginia. It is a hard ride, but his shop is off the map, and he owes me his life. I grabbed my heavy leather gloves from the gas tank, pulling them tightly onto my freezing hands. Are those bad men going to follow us? She asked, her voice shaking slightly. They will try, I said, swinging my heavy leg back over the wide leather seat. But they have to catch me first. And I promise you, Maya, nobody catches Jackson Ford when he has something precious to protect. I kicked the heavy engine back to life. The tunnel roared, the loud echo pushing the cold silence away. We roared out of the dark, conwet tunnel, tearing right back into the teeth of the winter storm. The highway stretching south out of Pennsylvania was a treacherous, terrifying ribbon of black ice and blowing snow. I kept the heavy motorcycle in a low gear. I let the deep rumbling engine do the hard work of keeping us steady, fighting the slick patches, fighting the vicious crosswinds. Maya held on to me with a desperate frozen strength. I could feel her small helmet pressing hard against my leather back. I could feel her small boots tucked tight against my legs, trying to find whatever warmth the massive engine could offer. She was entirely too small for a ride like this. She was entirely too young to be running for her life. But we had no other choice. We had to keep moving. As we chewed up the icy miles, my mind started working. I started putting the broken, ugly pieces of the puzzle together. Richard Sterling. The name tasted like battery acid in my mouth. 3 years ago, Richard Sterling was the powerful, untouchable president of our motorcycle club. He was a man who wore expensive suits, drove polished black cars, and liked to pretend he was a legitimate businessman. But underneath the expensive clothes, he was nothing but a greedy, ruthless thief. I had discovered a terrible secret. Sterling had been quietly, systematically skimming money out of a private fund. It was a sacred fund, built from the blood and sweat of the club, meant entirely for the grieving widows and orphaned children of 3 members who had died in a terrible highway crash. Sterling was stealing their survival money, using it to fund his own lavish, corrupt lifestyle. I did not take my discovery to the club council. I did not ask for a vote. I handled it the old, brutal way. I waited for him in his dark, expensive office. I locked the heavy oak door. I did not use a weapon. I just used my hands, my heavy boots, and my pure, blinding rage. I beat Richard Sterling within a single inch of his life. I broke his jaw. I broke his ribs, and I completely broke his pride. I forced him bleeding and terrified to transfer every single stolen penny directly into the bank accounts of those 3 struggling widows. The very next morning, I threw my club patch on his desk, I started my motorcycle, and I rode away forever. I walked away from the only family I had ever known. Sterling had the deep pockets to hire a phantom like Tommy Callahan. He had the cold, bitter patience to wait 3 long years. He wanted me to get comfortable. He wanted me to think I was safe, forgotten, and invisible. And now he had decided that his bruised ego finally required a permanent, bloody solution. But Sterling made a massive, fatal mistake. He thought I was just a tired, broken old man, waiting quietly to die. He did not know about the little girl riding on my back. He did not know that by attacking me, he had accidentally threatened the only piece of Elena Rostova left in this miserable world. The gray sky slowly turned to a deep, bruising purple and then faded into a pitch-starless black. We crossed the state line into West Virginia. The roads immediately grew narrower, winding sharply up into the dark, jagged teeth of the Appalachian Mountains. The snow was not falling as heavily up here, but the air was significantly colder. It was a sharp, biting cold that cut right through my leather deep into my aching bones. Maya had stopped shivering about an hour ago. That scared me more than anything else. When a body gets too cold, it stops fighting. It just goes to sleep. I reached one thick hand behind my back, feeling for her leg, making sure she was still holding on. She was there, but she was entirely still. I pushed the heavy engine harder, twisting the throttle, racing up the steep, winding mountain pass. Deep in the thick, silent pine forest, miles away from any paved road, I finally saw the rusted, sagging chain-link fence. The faded, bullet-riddled metal sign hanging above the gate read, "Henderson Heavy Repair." It was a massive, sprawling salvage yard, hidden completely from the rest of the civilized world. It was filled with the rusted, hollowed-out skeletons of old cars, massive semi-trucks, and forgotten farm equipment. I pulled the motorcycle up to the chained gate. I hit the horn, a loud, piercing blast that echoed violently through the quiet, frozen trees. A few seconds later, a massive, scarred German shepherd came running out from under a rusted school bus, barking viciously, throwing his heavy body against the metal fence. Then, the heavy corrugated metal door of the main garage slowly rolled up. A figure stepped out into the dull yellow light. It was Doc Henderson. Doc was an old combat medic, a scarred veteran from the humid, bloody jungles of Vietnam. He was a tall, incredibly thin man, with skin like worn leather and wild gray hair poking out from under a greasy baseball cap. He walked with a heavy, painful limp, dragging his left leg slightly. He was holding a pump-action shotgun, holding it casually but holding it ready. He walked up to the chained gate. He shined a bright, blinding flashlight directly into my tired face. "Turn off the engine, Rooster." Doc growled, his voice sounding like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. I hit the kill switch. The sudden silence was heavy. The cold mountain air rushed in. "You are a long way from nowhere, Jackson," Doc said, lowering the bright flashlight, slightly resting the heavy barrel of the shotgun on his shoulder. "And you know I do not like unexpected company, especially company that comes knocking in the middle of a winter freeze." "I need a fire, Doc," I said, my voice completely exhausted, my breath pluming white in the freezing air. "I need thick walls, and I need a closed door. I have got a bad shadow following me." Doc spat a dark stream of chewing tobacco onto the frozen dirt. He looked at me, his eyes hard and completely unforgiving. "Your shadows are always bad, Jackson," Doc said, his voice bitter. "Your shadows always end up bleeding on my clean garage floor. I told you 3 years ago when I stitched up that knife wound in your shoulder. I told you we were entirely square. You saved my life in the desert a long time ago, and I saved yours. The ledger is clean. I do not owe you a single thing. You do not owe me anything." I agreed, my freezing hands gripping the handlebars tight. "But I am not asking for me." I stepped off the heavy motorcycle. I moved carefully, my joints stiff and screaming in pain. I reached around to the back seat. I gently lifted Maya off the cold leather. Her small body was completely rigid. Her head fell heavily against my shoulder. She was barely awake, her dark eyes half closed, her lips dangerously pale. I cradled her against my chest, holding her tight, trying to share whatever body heat I had left. The old cloth doll slipped from her fingers, but I managed to catch it before it hit the dirty snow. Doc Henderson completely froze. The hard, angry scowl vanished from his weathered face. He looked at the tiny, freezing girl in my heavy arms. He looked at her cheap, dirty coat. He looked at her pale, shivering face. The tough, bitter mechanic disappeared. The old combat medic, the man who had spent his youth desperately trying to keep broken people alive, instantly took over. "Good God Almighty, Jackson," Doc whispered, his rough voice cracking in the cold. He immediately dropped the heavy padlock. He kicked the rusted metal gate open with his good leg. "Get her inside right now," Doc commanded, stepping aside, pointing toward the bright, warm garage. "Get her out of this wind. Move, old man, move." I carried her quickly past the rusted trucks, past the barking dog, and walked straight into the main garage. The air inside was glorious. It was thick, smelling strongly of old motor oil, gasoline, and burning wood. In the center of the massive concrete room, a large cast-iron stove was roaring, throwing out a massive wave of beautiful, intense heat. "Bring her into the back office," Doc ordered. Throwing his shotgun onto a crowded workbench, rushing past me with a sudden, frantic energy. I followed him into a small, cluttered room at the back of the massive garage. It was a messy office, filled with stacks of greasy paperwork, empty coffee cups, and old car parts. In the corner there was a worn, sagging leather couch. Doc threw a pile of dirty shop towels off the couch. "Lay her down right here," he said. I gently laid Maya onto the cracked leather. She let out a small, trembling sigh, curling herself into a tight, defensive ball. Doc moved incredibly fast for a crippled man. He grabbed a heavy, thick wool blanket from a nearby shelf, shaking off the dust, and threw it completely over her small body. He grabbed a small electric space heater, plugged it into the wall, and aimed the glowing orange coils directly at her freezing boots. He knelt down beside the couch. He took off his dirty mechanic gloves. He gently took her small, freezing face in his rough, calloused hands. He checked her pulse. He looked deep into her half-open eyes. "She is in the early stages of hypothermia," Doc muttered, his voice completely professional, completely focused. "Her core temperature has dropped way too low. We need to warm her up slowly from the inside out." He turned his head, looking up at me. The professional medic was gone. The angry old man was back, and he was glaring at me with a pure, unadulterated fury. "I am going to the kitchen to heat up some chicken broth." Doc said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "You sit in that chair. You watch her breathe. And when I get back, Jackson, you are going to tell me exactly why you brought an 8-year-old child into a killing freeze with a target painted directly on her back." He stood up, his bad knee popping loudly. He walked out of the small office, slamming the thin wooden door behind him. I pulled up a broken plastic lawn chair. I sat down next to the worn leather couch. I leaned forward, resting my heavy elbows on my knees. I watched Maya breathe. I watched the thick wool blanket rise and fall slowly, steadily. I reached out gently, placing the one-eyed cloth doll back into her small, warming hands. The heat of the small room was finally seeping into my own freezing bones, but I still felt incredibly cold. I was tired. I was so incredibly tired of the fighting, the running, the constant bleeding. But looking at Maya sleeping quietly under the heavy blanket, I knew the hardest, most brutal fight of my entire life was only just beginning. I sat in that broken plastic chair, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of the thick wool blanket. Maya was finally asleep. Her breathing was shallow, but it was regular. The electric heater buzzed loudly in the corner, pushing a wall of dry, beautiful heat directly against my frozen, heavy boots. The wooden door suddenly creaked open. Doc walked back into the small, messy office. He was carrying a chipped ceramic mug, hot steam rising in thick, twisting white clouds. He walked past me, completely ignoring my presence. He knelt down right beside the cracked leather couch. He gently nudged Maya awake, lifting her small head with a soft, careful hand. "Drink this, little bird," Doc whispered. His rough, gravelly voice turned surprisingly gentle. "Drink it slow. It will chase the deep ice right out of your belly." Maya took a small, careful sip. Her dark eyes barely open. She drank exactly half of the hot chicken broth, then drifted right back into a deep, exhausted sleep. Doc set the warm mug down on a rusty metal filing cabinet. He pulled the thick wool blanket all the way up to her chin, tucking it tightly around her small shoulders. Doc stood up, his bad knee cracking loudly in the quiet room. He looked down at me, his weathered face hard, completely stripped of any warmth or mercy. He jerked his gray head toward the office door, offering a silent, angry command. "Outside," he muttered. I stood up, my own joints aching from the freezing ride. I followed him out into the massive, echoing garage. The giant cast-iron stove was roaring in the center of the concrete room, radiating an intense, baking heat. Doc limped over to a heavy wooden workbench covered in scattered rusted tools and dirty oil rags. He grabbed a dark glass bottle of cheap, strong whiskey, unscrewed the black plastic cap, and took a long, heavy pull. He did not offer me the bottle. He just set it down hard on the wood. "Who is she, Jackson?" Doc asked, wiping his mouth with the back of his greasy, scarred hand. "And do not give me a half-baked lying story. I want the absolute, ugly truth. Right now." I stood near the roaring iron stove, letting the intense heat soak deep into my heavy leather jacket. I looked at the bright orange flames dancing behind the metal grate. "Her name is Maya," I said, keeping my voice low, heavy, and completely honest. Her mother was Elena Rostova. Doc stopped moving. His hand hovered right over the dark glass bottle. He stared at me, his gray, tired eyes widening slightly in the dim yellow garage light. He remembered her. Everyone who rode with our old crew back in the late 70s remembered Elena. She was the absolute only good, clean, innocent thing that had ever walked into our filthy, violent clubhouse. "Elena," Doc whispered, shaking his head slowly, looking down at the dirty concrete floor. Good God Almighty. That poor, sweet woman finally managed to escape this brutal, bloody life, and now her little girl is dragged right back into the terrible dark. He slammed his heavy hand down onto the wooden workbench, the loud smack echoing loudly through the massive garage. "What did you do, Rooster?" Doc demanded, his voice rising, filling with a sudden, vicious anger. "Who is hunting you tonight? Tell me the name." "Richard Sterling." I said the name, tasting incredibly bitter, like old copper in my dry mouth. "He hired Tommy Callahan to put me in the ground. They ambushed me at a diner right near the border of Pennsylvania. Maya was there. She saw the cook poison my food. She saved my life, Doc. Elena told her to find me, and she actually did." Doc let out a harsh, barking laugh. It was a cold, cruel sound, completely devoid of any real humor. "Elena sent her to you?" he asked, pointing a dirty, grease-stained finger directly at my heavy chest. Elena must have been out of her absolute mind, or she was completely, utterly desperate. Because you, Jackson, you are a walking, breathing graveyard. The heavy words hit me hard, striking my chest like a physical heavy blow. I flinched, but I did not look away. "I am trying to protect her, Doc," I argued, my thick hands clenching tightly into large fists at my sides. "I am the only person she has left in this entirely miserable world." "Protect her!" Doc yelled, his rough voice echoing violently off the corrugated metal walls. "You do not know the very first thing about protecting anything, Rooster. Look at your life. Look at the absolute wreckage you always leave behind you." He limped aggressively toward me, ignoring the obvious pain in his bad leg, stopping just a few inches from my scarred face. He smelled like cheap whiskey, old sweat, and righteous anger. "Your old club is entirely gone." Doc spat, his eyes burning with a fierce intensity. "Your real family, your own sister, refuses to even speak your name. Everywhere you go, Jackson violence follows right behind you like a hungry, starving dog. Everything you touch, it turns to ash. You are not a father. You are a killer." I did not step back. I stood my absolute ground, but I could not look him in the eye anymore. I stared down at the tips of my heavy, worn boots. I knew he was entirely right. I knew every single painful, devastating word he spoke was completely true. I was a violent man, completely built for a violent, unforgiving world. I had absolutely no idea how to be a guardian, a protector, or a safe harbor for a grieving, broken child. "Elena used to laugh," Doc said softly, his voice suddenly dropping, almost talking to himself. "She used to sit right in the middle of our loud, filthy clubhouse, and she would just laugh. She made us feel like we were actual human beings, instead of just wild, angry animals. You broke her heart, Rooster. You chose the violent club over her. And now, 20 years later, her ghost sends her daughter right back to your bloody doorstep." Doc let out a long, heavy, exhausted sigh. The sudden explosive anger seemed to drain entirely out of his thin, tired body. He leaned back heavily against a rusted car engine, rubbing his gray eyes with his dirty hands. "Listen to me, brother," Doc said, his rough voice softening, dropping back to a quiet, incredibly weary tone. "I know you want to do the right thing. I see it buried deep in your tired eyes. But wanting to be a good man and actually being a good man, those are two completely different, very hard roads." He looked straight at me, his expression entirely serious. You cannot run forever. Doc continued, his voice completely flat. Tommy Callahan does not ever quit. He is a ghost. Richard Sterling will empty his massive bank accounts just to see you dead. If you keep this little girl sitting on the back of your motorcycle, they will eventually catch you. They will kill you, and they absolutely will not spare her. You know that. You know exactly how these evil men operate in the dark. I slowly raised my heavy head. I looked at the old combat medic staring right into his tired, haunted eyes. I felt a cold, hard resolve settling deep into my bones, freezing my blood, completely pushing away the tired fear. I am not running anymore. Doc, I said. My voice completely steady, completely cold, completely devoid of any doubt. I'm entirely done running. Tomorrow morning, as soon as the sun comes up, I'm going to end this. I'm going to draw Sterling completely out into the open, and I'm going to finish the fight once and for all. Doc looked at me for a long, heavy, silent minute. He could see the dark, terrible truth settling into my expression. He knew exactly what I was planning to do. He knew the incredibly high, deadly price I was fully prepared to pay. And what happens to the little girl? Doc asked quietly, his voice barely a rough whisper. If you do not ride back from that terrible fight. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the hot, dry air of the garage fill my tired lungs. That is exactly why I brought her to you. I whispered the heavy, undeniable truth, finally hanging entirely bare in the warm room. If I fall, Doc, if I do not come back tomorrow, I need you to keep her safe. I need you to hide her. I need you to protect her exactly the way you protected me in the jungle. Do you understand me? Doc did not say a single word. He just stared deeply at the roaring cast iron stove, watching the bright orange flames lick the black burning metal. The heavy, quiet tension hung thickly in the massive garage, thick as the smell of old oil and bitter, heavy regrets. I did not sleep that night. I did not even close my heavy, tired eyes for a single second. I sat in the dark, massive garage right next to the roaring cast iron stove. The thick metal radiated a beautiful baking heat, keeping the bitter Appalachian cold pushed safely outside. I listened to the dry wood popping, snapping loudly in the bright orange flames. I listened to the violent howling wind ripping through the frozen pine trees high above the rusted tin roof. But mostly, I just listened to the heavy, absolute silence of my own terrible regrets. I thought about Elena Rostova. I thought about her bright, ringing laugh echoing through our filthy, smoke-filled clubhouse 20 long years ago. I thought about the soft, gentle way she used to look at me before she finally realized I was a man entirely broken beyond repair. I thought about her dying completely alone in a sterile white hospital room with nothing left in her hands but a dirty piece of paper and my useless name. The dark hours dragged on heavy, slow and incredibly painful. Eventually, the pitch-black sky outside the small, dirty windows began to turn a bruised shade of gray. Morning was finally coming to the mountains. It was not a warm, welcoming sunrise. It was a cold, pale, unforgiving light creeping slowly over the frozen, jagged peaks. Doc Henderson was already awake. He was a man who had spent a lifetime in war zones, and he possessed the restless, broken sleep schedule of a true combat veteran. He limped out of the back room, his bad knee popping loudly in the quiet, empty garage. He walked over to a greasy metal workbench and started brewing a fresh pot of terrible, thick black coffee. He did not say a single word to me. He did not ask how I was feeling. We were way past the point of polite, meaningless conversation. I stood up, my heavy joints screaming, popping loudly in protest. My back was stiff, aching deeply from the cold ride. I walked over to my motorcycle parked in the shadows near the heavy rolling door. I flipped open the thick leather saddlebag. I reached deep inside, moving past my spare tools, and pulled out two very important items. The first item was a cheap black prepaid burner cell phone. It was completely untraceable, bought with dirty cash 3 years ago, and kept turned off ever since. The second item was a thick, heavy yellow manila envelope. I held the envelope in my calloused hands. It felt incredibly heavy, carrying the weight of massive, deadly secrets. Inside that thick paper, I held the original handwritten financial ledgers belonging to Richard Sterling. When I beat him in his expensive office 3 years ago, I did not just force him to return the stolen money. I broke into his private safe. I took his absolute, most guarded, most dangerous secrets. I took the undeniable written proof of every single bribe, every single theft, and every single corrupt payoff he had ever made. It was my ultimate insurance policy. It was a massive loaded gun pointed directly at his entire life. And today, I was finally going to pull the trigger. I walked toward the side door of the massive garage. I pushed it open, stepping out into the freezing gray mountain air. The bitter wind immediately hit my face, biting hard, stinging my tired eyes. I needed the cold air. I needed the sharp, painful sting to clear my head, to completely wake up the ruthless, violent man I used to be. I stood in the frozen dirt, staring out at the rusted, hollowed-out skeletons of the old cars. I pressed the power button on the cheap black phone. The small green screen lit up, searching desperately for a weak cell signal in the deep mountains. It found one barely. I punched in a private unlisted phone number. It was a number I had memorized 3 years ago, a number that belonged entirely to a private encrypted phone sitting on Richard Sterling's expensive mahogany desk. I held the cheap plastic to my cold ear. I listened to it ring. It rang once. It rang twice. The heavy silence between the digital rings felt incredibly long, stretching out over the freezing wind. On the fourth ring, the line clicked loudly. The connection was made. "Who is this?" a voice answered. The voice was incredibly smooth, deeply arrogant, and completely furious. It was Richard Sterling. He was not a man who ever received unexpected, untraceable phone calls on his private line. "Hello, Richard," I said, my rough, gravelly voice cutting through the digital static. "It has been a very long, very quiet 3 years." The line went completely, utterly dead silent. I could practically hear the gears violently grinding inside his head. I could feel his sudden, terrifying shock bleeding right through the cheap phone. He thought I was running blind. He thought I was just a scared, tired old man, desperately trying to survive in the freezing snow. He absolutely never expected me to call him directly. "Jackson," Sterling finally whispered, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. "You have a lot of absolute nerve calling this number. You are a dead man walking. Do you hear me? Tommy Callahan is going to find you, and he is going to make it incredibly slow and incredibly painful. Tommy Callahan is a ghost," I replied, keeping my voice completely calm. Completely flat, entirely devoid of any fear. "But I am standing right here, Richard. I am entirely real, and I am holding a very thick, very heavy yellow envelope in my freezing hands." I paused, letting the heavy, terrifying words sink deep into his arrogant brain. "Do you remember the private ledgers, Richard?" I asked, my voice turning incredibly cold. "Do you remember the detailed handwritten notebooks I took out of your wall safe right before I broke your jaw? The ones with the federal routing numbers, the ones documenting the exact bribes you paid to the local judges and the dirty money you funneled through the fake charities." Sterling did not say a single word. His breathing grew heavy, ragged, and completely panicked. "I made highly detailed, very clear copies of those ledgers, Richard." I lied, my voice steady, pushing the bluff completely to the edge. "And right now, at this exact moment, I have a package sitting inside a post office box. If I don't make a very specific phone call by 5 o'clock tonight, that package gets mailed directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Washington, D.C. They will seize your massive bank accounts. They will seize your big, beautiful house. You will die in a tiny concrete federal cell wearing a cheap orange jumpsuit. The silence on the line was deafening. I had him. I had him backed completely into a dark, terrifying corner. Men titanyidpun like Richard Sterling. Men who loved money and soft beds. They feared federal prison far more than they feared actual physical death. "What do you want, Rooster?" Sterling finally choked out, his arrogant voice completely broken, completely defeated. "I want to end this," I said, my voice heavy as solid iron. "I want a face-to-face meeting. Just you and just me, Pio. We are going to settle this right out in the open." "Where?" he asked, his voice shaking with a sudden deep paranoia. "There is an old abandoned coal waste station sitting right on Route 52, I told him, looking out at the jagged mountain peaks. "It is about 40 miles south of your current location. It is completely empty, completely isolated. You show up there at high noon today. You call off Tommy Callahan completely. You call off all of your heavily armed dogs. If I see a single unknown shadow moving in those trees, or if I see a single helicopter in the sky, I walk away, and the feds get your entire life's work. Do you understand me?" Sterling hesitated. He was a coward, and cowards completely hate meeting dangerous men in the open daylight. "I understand," Sterling whispered, the bitter defeat heavy in his throat. "High noon, Route 52. "Do not be late, Richard," I said. I am not a very patient man anymore. I pressed the red button. The call ended, cutting off his ragged breathing. I stood there in the freezing dirt, holding the cheap black phone. I took a slow, deep breath of the sharp mountain air. The trap was completely set. The final terrible game was finally in motion. I turned around, walking back toward the heavy side door of the garage. I pushed it open, stepping back into the thick, warm air. Doc Henderson was standing right there. He was leaning heavily against his wooden workbench, holding 2 steaming chipped ceramic mugs of black coffee. He looked at me, his gray, tired eyes reading my expression entirely perfectly. He knew exactly what I had just done. He knew the incredibly dangerous, violent path I had just committed to walking. "Is it done?" Doc asked quietly, his rough voice carrying over the crackling cast-iron stove. "It is done," I nodded, taking the warm, heavy mug from his scarred hand. "I'm meeting him at the old Route 52 coal station. High noon." Doc took a slow, thoughtful sip of his bitter coffee. He looked down the dark hallway toward the small, messy office where Maya was still sleeping peacefully under the heavy wool blanket. "You are walking into a massive, heavily armed trap." "Jackson," Doc said, his voice entirely devoid of judgment, just stating a hard, simple fact. "Sterling is a completely cornered rat. Cornered rats never play by the rules. He is going to bring heavily armed men. He is going to try to kill you in the dirt." "I know," I said softly, taking a long drink of the terrible coffee, letting the burning heat hit my empty stomach. "I am entirely counting on it." I walked back down the dark, narrow hallway. I pushed the wooden door open very slowly, trying not to let the rusted hinges squeak. Maya was still completely asleep on the cracked leather couch. The electric heater was still glowing bright orange, pushing a steady wave of dry heat across her small boots. Her dark hair was scattered wildly across the dirty pillow. She looked incredibly small, incredibly fragile, buried entirely under that heavy wool blanket. I stood there for a long minute. I watched her chest rise and fall. I reached down to my hand. I pulled off a heavy, scarred silver ring. It was a solid silver eagle, a ring I had worn every single day for over 20 years. I set it down very quietly on the metal filing cabinet, right next to her empty coffee mug. I wanted her to know when she finally woke up that I was coming back for it. I was coming back for her. I turned around and I walked out into the massive garage. Doc was waiting for me, near the heavy rolling steel door. He had a battered olive green canvas duffel bag sitting on the floor. Inside, I could see the dark, heavy metal of a scoped hunting rifle and several boxes of heavy ammunition. He was not just sending me out into the cold with good wishes. He was sending me out ready for a brutal, absolute war. I loaded the rifle with hollow points. Doc said, his rough voice completely devoid of emotion. You keep your distance, Jackson. Do not let Sterling draw you into a close fight. He will have snipers. He will have men hiding in the high rocks. I know, Doc, I said, grabbing the heavy canvas bag, slinging the thick strap completely over my broad shoulder. I am going to lock this massive steel door the absolute second you ride out. Doc told me, resting his hand heavily on his pump-action shotgun. I am not opening it for anyone, Jackson. Not for the local cops, not for the state police, and absolutely not for Richard Sterling. I will burn this entire garage to the ground before I let them take that little girl. Thank you, brother, I said, my voice thick, heavy with genuine gratitude. I swung my leg over the motorcycle. I kicked the engine to life. It roared violently, echoing loudly against the corrugated metal walls. Doc hit the large, dirty button on the wall. The heavy steel door slowly rolled up, letting the freezing, blinding daylight pour entirely into the dark garage. I rode out into the cold mountain air. I did not look back. I headed straight down the winding, icy mountain road, riding directly toward Route 52. Now I need to take a pause right here. I need to tell you what happened back at that rusted, frozen salvage yard after I rode away. I did not see it happen myself. I was out on the highway preparing to face down a ghost. But Doc Henderson told me the entire story a few days later. He told me every single heartbreaking detail. Maya woke up about an hour after I left the mountain. She opened her dark eyes, completely confused by the strange, messy room. She sat up slowly, the thick wool blanket falling off her small shoulders. She looked around the empty office. She saw the rusted car parts, the massive stacks of greasy paperwork, and the heavy silver ring sitting quietly on the metal cabinet. She picked up the heavy ring. She held it tightly in her small hand. She knew exactly what it meant. She knew I had left her behind. She wrapped the heavy wool blanket completely around her small body, dragging it across the dirty concrete floor. She walked out of the dark office holding her broken, one-eyed cloth doll tightly against her chest. She walked out into the massive, echoing garage. Doc Henderson was sitting in a broken, rusted lawn chair right next to the roaring cast-iron stove. He was holding an oily rag, slowly, methodically cleaning the dark metal barrel of his shotgun. He looked incredibly scary. He was a tall, scarred, grumpy old man, sitting alone in the dark, surrounded by absolute wreckage. Maya stopped walking. She stood completely frozen in the shadows, staring at the big weapon in his rough hands. Doc heard her small boots scraping softly on the concrete. He stopped cleaning the gun. He did not make any sudden fast movements. He very slowly placed the heavy shotgun down on the wooden floor, pushing it completely out of sight, under a dirty tarp. He looked up at her, his gray, tired eyes softening completely. "Good morning, little bird," Doc said, his rough, gravelly voice trying incredibly hard to sound gentle. "You slept for a very long time. You must be completely starving." Maya did not say a word. She just looked around the massive empty garage, her dark eyes searching frantically for my heavy motorcycle. Your rooster had to go run a very important errand, Doc told her, reading her terrified face perfectly. He had to go take care of some bad business down in the valley, but he asked me to watch over you. He asked me to keep you entirely safe and entirely warm. Maya looked down at the dirty concrete. Is he going to come back? She whispered, her voice shaking slightly. Jackson is a very stubborn, very hard man, Doc said, letting out a small, tired sigh. He is the toughest bastard I have ever known. He always comes back, Maya. He always finishes the ride. Doc slowly stood up, his bad knee popping loudly in the quiet room. He limped heavily over to a small, greasy hot plate sitting on a rusted metal drum. Do you like scrambled eggs, kid? Doc asked, cracking 2 white eggs into a small, dented metal pan. It is the only thing I know how to cook that will not completely poison you. Maya walked closer, slowly, carefully. She sat down on a wooden crate right near the intense baking heat of the cast-iron stove. Doc cooked the eggs. He scooped them onto a chipped paper plate, handing them down to her with a plastic fork. She ate quietly, taking small, careful bites. Doc sat back down in his broken lawn chair. He pulled out a small tin of chewing tobacco, but he looked at her and slowly put it completely back into his dirty pocket. He looked at the old tattered cloth doll sitting on her lap. That doll has seen some incredibly hard miles, Doc said, pointing a scarred finger at the blind, empty side of the doll's face. Maya looked down at the toy. She touched the frayed, torn fabric where the button eye used to be. Her name is Daisy, Maya whispered. My mom made her for me a long, long time ago. She lost her eye on the bus. We were running very fast, and she fell down on the dirty floor. Doc stared at the broken doll. The tough, hardened combat medic, the man who had seen incredibly terrible things in the thick, bloody jungles, completely melted inside. He stood up without saying a single word. He limped heavily over to a tall, rusted metal toolbox. He opened the top drawer, digging past heavy wrenches, dirty spark plugs, and sharp screwdrivers. He pulled out a small olive-drab metal tin. It was his old military-issue sewing kit, the exact same kit he had used to stitch up bleeding soldiers 30 years ago. He limped back over to the warm stove. He sat down directly across from her. Bring Daisy over here. Little bird, Doc said gently, opening the small green tin. Maya stood up. She walked over, placing the broken doll very carefully into his massive, scarred, greasy hands. Doc dug through the small tin. He pulled out a shiny, solid brass button. It was an old button cut entirely off a heavy military uniform coat. He threaded a small silver needle with thick black nylon thread. He moved with incredible, surprising delicacy. His large, rough hands, built entirely for violence, and heavy steel, moved softly, carefully sewing the shiny brass button tightly onto the broken fabric. Maya watched him completely mesmerized. She watched the shiny needle dart in and out. I used to fix broken things for a living, Doc said quietly, his eyes entirely focused on the small stitches. I used to fix broken trucks, broken engines, and a whole lot of completely broken men. But sometimes, Maya, things get broken so badly, you just cannot put them back the exact way they were. He tied a tight, secure knot, snipping the thick black thread with a small pocket knife. When you lose somebody you love, Doc continued, his voice heavy, thick with his own ancient buried grief. It feels exactly like losing a piece of yourself. I lost a lot of good, brave brothers in the dirt. You lost your beautiful mama. The world takes incredibly heavy tolls from us, kid. He gently smoothed the messy yarn hair of the doll. But we do not stop living, Doc whispered, looking straight into her dark, sad eyes. We find completely new pieces. We sew them on tightly. We look a little bit different, and we carry some new heavy scars, but we just keep moving forward. That is exactly what your mama wanted for you. She wanted you to keep moving completely forward. He handed the doll back to her. The shiny brass button caught the bright orange light from the warm stove, completely replacing the blind, empty stare with a tough, bright new eye. Maya looked at the shiny brass button. She looked up at the scarred, grumpy old mechanic. She did not say a single word. She just stepped entirely forward, wrapping her small, thin arms completely around Doc's heavy, dirty neck. She hugged him tightly, burying her face completely in his rough, grease-stained jacket. Doc Henderson completely froze for a second. His big hands hovered awkwardly in the warm air. Then, very slowly, very gently, he wrapped his heavy arms around her small back. He closed his tired gray eyes, resting his chin softly on top of her dark hair. In that quiet, rusted garage, hidden entirely deep in the freezing mountains, two completely broken people found a small, entirely quiet moment of perfect peace. They found comfort in their completely shared pain. They found a new quiet strength waiting entirely for the dark storm to pass. But out on the cold, icy highway, the dark storm was not passing. The storm was waiting for me. I rode hard down the twisting, treacherous mountain roads. The biting wind whipped against my heavy leather jacket, but I did not feel the cold anymore. My blood was running entirely hot. My mind was completely clear, completely focused on the violent task ahead. I was not a tired, broken old man running for his life anymore. I was Jackson Ford, and I was bringing a dark, absolute reckoning right to Richard Sterling. Route 52 was a completely dead, forgotten stretch of gray asphalt. It cut straight through the deep, rocky valleys of West Virginia, surrounded by towering, dead pine trees. I saw the rusted leaning sign for the old coal way station about a mile ahead. It was a massive, completely abandoned concrete pad sitting right off the highway. There was a crumbling brick scale house entirely missing its roof and a large expanse of cracked, frozen gravel. It was the perfect place for a ghost to disappear, or for a very bad man to meet his end. I pulled my heavy motorcycle directly into the center of the massive concrete pad. I kicked the thick metal kickstand down. I shut off the loud, roaring engine. The sudden silence was heavy, absolute, and entirely deafening. The pale, weak winter sun was sitting directly overhead. It was exactly high noon. I unzipped the heavy olive-green canvas duffel bag. I pulled out Doc Henderson's scoped hunting rifle. It was a beautiful, deadly piece of cold steel. I checked the chamber, sliding a heavy hollow point round right into the barrel, but I did not shoulder the weapon. I did not hide behind the crumbling brick walls. I walked over and I leaned the loaded rifle visibly against the leather saddlebag of my motorcycle. I left it completely out in the open. Then I walked exactly 10 heavy paces away from my bike. I stood entirely alone, right in the dead center of the cracked, frozen concrete. I crossed my thick arms over my chest. I waited. In my dark, violent line of work, the absolute most dangerous thing you can ever face is a man who is standing completely out in the open. When a man does not seek cover, when a man does not hide in the shadows, it sends a very loud, very terrifying psychological message. It tells his enemies that he has absolutely nothing left to lose. It tells them that the trap is already sprung and they are standing right in the middle of it. At exactly 12 minutes past noon, I heard the deep, heavy crunch of large tires rolling over frozen gravel. A massive, polished black SUV pulled slowly off the gray highway. It looked completely ridiculous, entirely out of place in this rusted, forgotten graveyard. The dark-tinted windows rolled up tight. The heavy vehicle crept onto the concrete pad, stopping exactly 30 yards away from where I stood. The heavy driver's side door opened. Richard Sterling stepped out into the freezing mountain air. He looked exactly the same as he did 3 years ago. He was wearing an incredibly expensive dark cashmere overcoat, a tailored suit, and polished Italian leather shoes that were instantly ruined by the freezing slush. He looked rich, he looked powerful, and he looked completely, entirely terrified. The 2 back doors of the massive SUV opened simultaneously. 2 very large, incredibly dangerous-looking men stepped out. They were wearing heavy tactical gear, thick winter coats, and they were carrying short, incredibly lethal automatic rifles. They fanned out, keeping their heavy weapons pointed directly at the frozen ground, but keeping their cold eyes locked completely on my chest. "I told you to come alone, Richard," I called out, my rough, gravelly voice echoing loudly across the empty concrete. Sterling stood securely behind the heavy steel door of his vehicle. He looked at my entirely empty hands. Then he looked at the scoped rifle, leaning uselessly against my distant motorcycle. He offered a small, arrogant, nervous smile. "I never go anywhere completely alone." "Rooster!" Sterling yelled back, his voice shaking slightly over the bitter wind. "You know that. You are a complete fool, standing out there in the absolute open. You have nowhere to run, and you have nowhere to hide." "I am not running," I said, my voice dropping lower, turning incredibly hard, carrying over the distance like heavy thunder. "And I do not need to hide. Tell your 2 trained dogs to put their heavy guns back inside the truck, Richard, right now." Sterling laughed, a short, nervous barking sound. "Why in the world would I do that?" I reached inside the heavy inner pocket of my leather jacket. The 2 armed men instantly raised their heavy rifles, aiming directly at my chest, waiting for a single deadly command. I moved slowly, deliberately. I pulled out the thick, heavy yellow manila envelope. I held it up high, right in the pale winter sunlight. "Because of this, Richard," I yelled, shaking the heavy paper envelope, "this is exactly why you are going to tell them to stand down. I am holding every single dirty, corrupt secret you have ever desperately tried to bury." Sterling stopped, completely smiling. His pale face turned an even lighter shade of gray. "That is a completely empty bluff, Jackson," Sterling shouted, his voice cracking violently in the cold air. "You gave those ledgers completely back to me 3 years ago. I burned them in my own fireplace. I gave you the absolute originals, Richard," I lied, my voice ringing with complete, undeniable confidence. "Do you honestly think I am stupid enough to walk away from a dangerous, cornered rat without making detailed, perfect copies? I copied every single page. I copied the bank routing numbers, the offshore accounts, the exact names of the corrupt judges you paid off, and the exact dates you ordered the absolute worst bloody hits for the club." I took 3 slow, heavy steps entirely forward. The armed guards tensed, fingers resting heavily on their cold triggers. "If those 2 men shoot me right now," I told him, looking directly into his terrified, wide eyes, "my heart completely stops beating. And if my heart stops beating, my phone call does not happen. And if my phone call does not happen at exactly 5 o'clock tonight, a locked, sealed package gets dropped directly into the federal mail. The Federal Bureau of Investigation gets your entire miserable life delivered right to their clean desks." The total absolute silence that followed was incredibly beautiful. I could clearly hear the heavy wind whistling through the dead pine trees. "They will freeze every single penny you own, Richard," I continued, pushing the psychological knife completely to the hilt. "They will seize your massive house, they will take your polished cars, and they will throw you into a tiny, freezing concrete cell. You will never sleep on soft silk sheets again. You will never eat a hot, decent meal again. You will die alone behind incredibly thick steel bars, entirely forgotten by the world." Sterling stared at me, his chest heaving violently, his breathing short and shallow. He was doing the cold, hard math inside his corrupt head. He knew I was a very dangerous man, but he also knew I was an honest, blunt instrument. I did not usually lie. He believed me. He completely, utterly believed the heavy bluff. He slowly raised his shaking, manicured hand. He snapped his fingers once. The two heavily armed men looked at him completely confused. Sterling nodded his head toward the dark SUV. Very slowly, with extreme, clear reluctance, the two men lowered their heavy rifles. They stepped completely back, sliding quietly into the warm leather interior of the vehicle, closing the heavy doors behind them. Sterling stepped entirely out from behind the heavy steel door. He walked slowly forward the frozen slush, completely ruining his expensive shoes, until he stood exactly 10 feet away from me. "What do you absolutely want, Rooster?" Sterling whispered, his voice completely broken, completely stripped of all its fake, arrogant power. "I want the ghost," I demanded, keeping my heavy eyes locked entirely on his pale face. "I want Tommy Callahan completely called off, right now. You pull your cell phone completely out of your expensive pocket. You call him. You put him on the loudspeaker. And you cancel the heavy contract." Sterling hesitated, his hands trembling violently in the cold wind. He hated losing. He hated entirely surrendering his power. "Do it, Richard," I growled, taking one massive, intimidating step entirely forward. "Or I walk completely back to my heavy bike. I ride completely away, and you can absolutely start trying to pack your bags for Mexico." Sterling completely broke. The arrogant, untouchable club president entirely crumbled into a weak, terrified old man. He reached into his thick coat pocket with a shaking hand. He pulled out a small, incredibly expensive silver cell phone. He dialed a private encrypted number. He pressed the speaker button, holding the phone up in the freezing air between us. The phone rang twice. It connected with a sharp digital click. "Yes," a voice answered. It was a cold, completely empty, completely dead voice. It was the absolute terrifying sound of the ghost. It was Tommy Callahan. "Tommy," Sterling said, his voice shaking violently, completely, betraying his absolute terror. "It is entirely over. The contract is completely dead. Call off the remaining men. You absolutely leave Jackson Ford alone." The cold line was entirely silent for 3 agonizing seconds. "You completely understand the very steep, heavy cancellation fee, Richard?" Callahan asked, his voice entirely devoid of any emotion. "I understand," Sterling choked out, completely closing his tired eyes. "Just completely drop it. Walk entirely away." "Understood," Callahan replied. The line clicked entirely dead. Sterling slowly lowered his shaking hand. He looked at me, a deep, bitter hatred burning intensely in his tired eyes. "It is completely done, Jackson," Sterling whispered. "You have your miserable absolute life back." I put the thick, heavy yellow envelope completely back into my inside pocket. I stared down at the small, broken man standing in the freezing slush. "You listen to me very carefully, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a low, incredibly dangerous whisper. "If I ever see your completely terrible face again, if I ever hear a single, completely strange footstep walking behind me in the dark, I will absolutely not bother with the federal government. I will completely come for you myself, and I will completely finish the job I entirely started 3 years ago. Do you absolutely understand me?" Sterling did not say a single heavy word. He just nodded his head once, entirely defeated. He turned completely around, walking slowly back to his polished, massive black truck. He climbed inside, shutting the heavy door loudly. The massive SUV slowly backed away, turning completely around on the frozen gravel, and drove quickly away down the gray, entirely desolate highway. I stood there, entirely alone, right in the dead center of the massive concrete pad. The freezing wind whipped hard against my heavy leather jacket. I took a very slow, incredibly deep breath, letting the sharp, bitter air completely fill my tired old lungs. It was absolutely, entirely, finally over. The heavy, dark shadow was completely gone. The heavy, terrible weight I had been carrying on my tired shoulders for 3 entire days finally entirely vanished. I walked completely back to my heavy motorcycle. I grabbed the scoped rifle, sliding it completely back into the olive canvas bag. I swung my heavy, aching leg right over the wide leather seat. I started the massive, thundering engine. I did not look completely back at the entirely empty, completely broken way station. I pulled the heavy throttle, turning the front wheel completely around. I rode straight entirely back toward the freezing, dark mountains. I was entirely riding back to a rusted, completely forgotten garage. I was completely riding back to an entirely grumpy, old combat medic and a completely, entirely beautiful little girl. I was entirely, absolutely going home. The ride back up the mountain felt different. The icy wind was still blowing, the snow was still falling, but the crushing weight on my chest was completely gone. For the very first time in 3 long, bitter years, I was not looking over my shoulder. I was not checking my mirrors for phantoms or waiting for a sudden, violent ambush in the dark. I was just a man riding a heavy motorcycle, heading back to a rusted garage. I took the winding, steep curves, slowly letting the deep, rumbling engine echo against the frozen pine trees. I thought about the massive, empty way station. I thought about Richard Sterling driving away in his polished black truck, his empire built entirely on lies and stolen money. I had walked away from his corrupt world, and I had finally entirely closed the heavy door. The dark shadows of my past were finally laid to rest, buried deep under the freezing West Virginia snow. I saw the old sagging chain-link fence up ahead in the pale afternoon light. The massive, scarred German shepherd came running out from under the rusted school bus. He barked loudly, but his tail was wagging, recognizing the deep rumble of my engine. I pulled up to the heavy corrugated steel door. I hit the horn, one short, sharp blast that cut through the quiet mountain air. The heavy door slowly rolled up the old metal, groaning loudly in the freezing cold. The bright yellow light of the warm garage spilled out onto the white snow. I rolled the motorcycle inside, kicking the kickstand down and killing the roaring engine. The sudden silence was beautiful. The air inside smelled like old motor oil, burning dry wood, and fresh coffee. It smelled exactly like safety. Doc Henderson was standing near his wooden workbench, wiping his greasy hands on a dirty red rag. He looked at me, his gray, tired eyes searching my face, looking for any fresh blood or any new terrible regrets. He saw absolutely nothing but calm, quiet resolve. He nodded his gray head slowly, a deep, silent understanding passing completely between us. The war was over. Then I saw her. Maya stepped cautiously out from the dark, narrow hallway. She was wearing her dirty yellow canvas coat, holding her old, patched-up cloth doll tightly against her small chest. She stopped completely in her tracks, staring at me with her wide, dark eyes. She looked at my heavy, empty hands. She looked at my scarred, tired face. I reached into my heavy leather pocket, and I pulled out my silver eagle ring. I held it up high, showing it to her in the bright, warm light. "I told you, little bird," Doc said softly, his rough voice completely gentle. "He always finishes the ride." Maya ran. She did not hesitate. She did not wait. She ran entirely across the dirty concrete floor, her small boots slapping loudly on the ground. She crashed right into my heavy legs, wrapping her thin arms completely around my thick waist. She buried her small face deep into my cold leather jacket, holding on with a desperate absolute strength. I dropped slowly to one heavy knee, entirely ignoring the sharp pain in my joints. I wrapped my large, thick arms completely around her small shoulders. I pulled her close, resting my chin softly on top of her dark, tangled hair. She was safe. She was entirely, absolutely safe. "I am right here, Maya," I whispered, my rough voice cracking thick with an emotion I had not felt in decades. "The bad men are completely gone. They are never ever coming back. I promise you." She nodded her head against my chest, taking a slow, shaky breath. I stood back up, my old joints popping loudly. I looked over at Doc Henderson. The grumpy, hardened combat medic was entirely looking the other way, pretending to study a rusted wrench on his messy table, but I could clearly see him wiping his tired gray eyes. We spent one more night in that warm, rusted garage. I needed the sleep, and Maya needed the quiet, steady heat of the cast-iron stove. The next morning, the brutal winter storm finally broke. The thick gray clouds parted, revealing a bright, clear, freezing blue sky. The harsh Appalachian sun began melting the dangerous ice off the narrow mountain roads. It was absolutely time to go. I packed my heavy saddlebags. I folded the thick wool blanket, leaving it neatly on the cracked leather couch. I walked out into the main garage, finding Doc standing near the heavy rolling steel door. He handed me a small, heavy thermos, filled entirely with fresh, hot coffee. "You have a very long, very cold ride ahead of you, Jackson," Doc said, his rough voice completely serious. "The road south, heading down into North Carolina, they are going to be completely covered in salt and slick mud. You take it slow. You do not push the heavy machine." "I will take it slow." "Doc," I said, taking the warm thermos from his scarred hand. "I am in no absolute rush anymore." Doc looked down at Maya, who was entirely busy strapping her small yellow canvas backpack onto the back seat of my motorcycle. He smiled a genuine warm smile that entirely transformed his tired, weathered face. "You take good care of this grumpy old man, little bird," Doc told her, pointing a greasy finger in my direction. "He forgets to eat his vegetables, and he absolutely never listens to good advice." Maya smiled back, a small, beautiful smile. "I will take care of him, Doc," she promised, patting her repaired cloth doll. "Thank you for fixing Daisy's eye." Doc nodded, his gray eyes softening completely. "Anytime, kid." He turned back to me. He held out his large, rough, calloused hand. I took it, gripping it tightly. It was the firm, heavy handshake of two broken men, two old soldiers, who had completely survived the dark, terrible wars of their youth. "You are a good man, Rooster," Doc whispered, his voice incredibly quiet. "Do not ever let the dark ghosts tell you any different. You finally found your true road. Now, you just follow it all the way home." "Thank you, brother," I said, my voice thick with absolute gratitude. "For everything." I swung my heavy leg over the wide leather seat. Maya climbed up right behind me, wrapping her small, warm arms securely around my thick waist. I kicked the massive engine to life. It roared beautifully, completely ready for the long, open miles ahead. We rode out of the rusted salvage yard, entirely leaving the deep, quiet mountains of West Virginia completely behind us. We headed directly south, pointing the heavy front tire toward the deep, misty pine forests of Asheville, North Carolina. As we chewed up the long, gray miles on the open highway, I thought about the absolute journey that had completely brought me here. I thought about the strange, beautiful, completely unpredictable nature of this incredibly hard life. We spend so much of our short time on this earth desperately running. We run from our past mistakes. We run from our heavy regrets. And we run from the terrible pain of losing the people we love. We build massive walls around our beating hearts. We convince ourselves that it is safer to be entirely alone, that it is easier to ride solo than to risk entirely breaking again. But life in all its brutal absolute wisdom never completely lets us hide forever. Elena Rostova knew that. She knew that a man cannot survive in the absolute dark indefinitely. She knew that the broken pieces of our lives can only be put completely back together by the quiet, absolute grace of love, and by the heavy, undeniable responsibility we take for others. She did not send her daughter to me just to completely save Maya's life. She sent Maya to entirely, completely save mine. Resilience is not about being entirely tough. It is not about taking heavy punches or fighting brutal wars in the dark or riding a loud motorcycle through a freezing storm. True, absolute resilience is about the quiet, incredible courage it takes to care about something entirely outside of yourself. It is the absolute strength required to sew a shiny new brass button onto a broken cloth doll and believe that it is completely beautiful again. It is the deep, heavy courage to entirely open your battered heart. Let a small, grieving child completely inside and decide to become a father, long after you believed you were entirely nothing but a violent ghost. I was entirely done being a ghost. I was Jackson Ford. I was entirely a father. And I was completely, absolutely riding toward redemption, one long, beautiful mile at a time. Thank you so incredibly much for completely riding along with me on this long, emotional journey today. I completely hope this story reminded you to hold your own family close and to remember that no matter how entirely broken the road gets, there is always a chance to completely build a new, beautiful life. I would absolutely love to hear from you. Please take a quick moment to leave a comment down below and tell me exactly what beautiful city or quiet town you are listening from today. It entirely warms my heavy heart to see where all of you are out there in the big open world. And if this emotional story completely touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more long emotional tales from the open road. Keep moving entirely forward, my good friends, and please stay entirely safe out there.